Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the games of the former world chess champion Magnus Carlsen. Now, a few days ago, we covered the very start of the Superbet Rapid and Blitz event being held in Warsaw, Poland. It is part of the Grand Chess Tour. Now, in his very first game since he gave up the World Championship title, Magnus Carlsen decided to surprise the world by playing the Polish opening against the Polish player Radek Wojtaszek. Now, he lost the very first game. He was trying to claw his way back in. He had an okay result in the Rapid event, but yesterday, in the first day of the Blitz portion of the tournament, he won his last 5 games in a row. And so going into the final day with 9 Blitz games left, Magnus Carlsen was trailing only Jan Krzysztof Duda from Poland by half a point. Now let's take a look at a couple of his games. Now the first game we're going to take a look at was played very early on in the event today. It was the second round of the day. After drawing the first round, he was playing against Wesley. So Magnus starts out with the move b3 here. We get d5 being played by Wesley, and now we get knight to f3. Now, those of you guys who've watched some of my videos, some of my streams and everything else, this is an opening that I've played a lot with the white pieces. Also worth noting that after bishop b2, bishop g4, Magnus played this crazy move f3 against none other than the chess bra himself, Eric Hansen, in the World Rapid and Blitz being held in Astana, I believe it was, Kazakhstan. Maybe I have the city wrong, but he played this. He won a nice game against Eric, so it is an opening that Magnus has played a lot as well. This time around, we get knight to f3, knight to f6, and now Magnus plays bishop b2, Wesley plays c5, and here we get e3. Now, these first 4 starting moves, all pretty standard for both sides. I myself have played this a lot with the white pieces, as I alluded to before, so Wesley surely is ready to face it. Wesley plays e6 here. We get bishop to b5, knight b to d7, not bishop to d7, probably because Wesley simply did not want to trade off the bishops here. Now white can play castles, maybe even c4 and d4, maybe c4 and d3, but white has a very slight advantage here, and it's probably easier to play, which in a blitz game is considerable. So instead of playing bishop d7, we get knight b to d7 here, and now Wesley plays the move, or not Wesley, sorry, Magnus decides to castle, Wesley plays a6, and Magnus goes bishop e2. Here, Magnus does not trade his light square bishop for the knight on d7, because after bishop takes d7, bishop takes d7, white is still completely fine with a move like knight to e5, but nonetheless, black has the double bishop pair. So we get bishop to e2, bishop to e7 is played by Wesley, and now Magnus goes c4, and Wesley decides to castle out of the center of the board, and now we get c takes d5, knight takes d5, and knight c3. Now, one thing that has happened here is you look at the piece placements. Now, this position is pretty standard, not a whole lot is really out of the ordinary, but there are a couple things that stand out. First of all, black has put the knight on d7, whereas what black really would like to do here is put the knight on c6 so that it controls the d4 square. White does not have an easy pawn push in the center of the board. Now, with the knight being on d7, the knight on d7 is not optimally placed since you would like it on c6, so white can very easily play for d4. Secondarily, white has wasted tempos by going bishop to b5, a6, and bishop e2, so white has also lost time by putting the bishop on b5 and retreating it, but black also has a knight on d7, so what Magnus is saying here, not that he was thinking this during the actual game, but what he's essentially saying in this position is, I've wasted time to go bishop b5 and bishop e2, but your knight on d7 is worse placed than it would be on c6, so I should have a slight advantage here. So the game continues with this unusual move, knight takes c3. Now, if I were playing this position with the black pieces, probably I would consider a move like bishop to f6 here, and after a move like d4, then I would trade and go b6 followed by bishop b7. With the bishop on f6 interposing the bishop on c3, the other bishop going to the long diagonal, I do think that black should be completely fine here. Instead, we get knight takes c3, and Magnus decides to take with the pawn. Now, this is probably situational here. Magnus obviously wants to keep the game as alive as he can. If he had played bishop takes c3, black can once again play bishop to f6, trying to trade off these dark square bishops, and the position is very, very balanced here. Neither side has a whole lot going on, and early in the event, Magnus trying to climb from second place into leading the event, really wants to put pressure on Duda, and so he wants to keep pieces on the board, so he takes with the pawn. Now we get b6 being played by Wesley. Magnus goes queen c2. Idea to put one of the rooks in the center of the board, play c4, open up the long scope, maybe even knight g5 or bishop d3 down the line. But white's ideas are very straightforward here. So we get bishop to b7. Magnus plays rook fd1. We get queen to c7. And now we have this move bishop d3 being played here with the idea of putting pressure on this pawn on h7. So after bishop to d3, Wesley plays g6. Not a bad move by any stretch. And now Magnus plays this peculiar move bishop to e4. Now you would love to play c4 here and open up this diagonal for the dark square bishop. But once again, after c4, black potentially can go bishop to f6, trying to trade off these dark square bishops. Maybe even simpler is to just trade on f3 and then go bishop f6 here. Now you cannot avoid the bishop trade. Your pawn structure is a little bit worse as well, and black should be in no danger at all. So Magnus, sensing this, decides to gamble a little bit by playing bishop to e4. Now, as we know, Magnus Carlsen is also attempting to be a professional chess or professional poker player these days, I should say. So it's not too surprising that he gambles with bishop e4. Now, this move is not a great move because Wesley correctly plays this move c4. Now, you're probably wondering, well, what's so special about c4? White can just trade the bishops like in the game and maybe even just take on c4. Now, while white has an extra pawn here on c4, the pawns are stacked, and after rook a c8 here, it's very hard to keep control of this extra pawn on c4. If you play a move like rook to d4, for example, black can go bishop f6 here. Let's say you go rook f4. There's e5 attacking the rook again. Rook to g4. Now there's even h5 harassing the rook. If you go to e4, knight c5 will trap the rook here. You simply have no squares on the 4th rank anymore, and you can sack the rook on e5, but after bishop takes rook, knight takes, and rook fd8, black is just much better here with control of the only open file, can bring the queen to e4, the knight to e4, and even infiltrate with the rook on 7th rank. So you probably think, okay, but still, white doesn't have to take the pawn. Why is this better? Now, the reason this is so important is that now in this position, white has this very poor dark square bishop on b2 behind the pawn on c3. The whole point when we go back to the starting position where Magnus takes with the pawn is you want to eventually play c4 to open up scope. Now, Magnus didn't play c4 earlier because he realized that Wesley would simply try to trade off all the pieces and make a very standard boring draw. So Magnus gambles, but Wesley, however, does see the right concept here to lock the bishop behind the pawn on c3, and now it's very tricky to play. Magnus plays rook to d4, and we get pawn takes pawn. Now, this move is completely fine by Wesley, but it's not a move that I love here. Probably in this position, I would have played rook a c8, and after rook a d1, just rook fd8 here. Now, of course, in a blitz game, very easy to get concerned because you're sort of walking into this pin, but there isn't really anything white can do to put pressure on the knight or the rook on d7 and d8. If you take on c4 with the pawn, I can just simply move the knight to f6, for example, and the rook is guarded on d8. If you don't take the pawn, say you play a move like queen to d2, again, I can just go knight f6 since I'm overprotecting the rook on d8, and white really has no advantage whatsoever. So Wesley decides here to take on b3. Now, of course, completely fine, but now Magnus will be able to eventually play c4 and open up this diagonal for the dark square bishop. Wesley goes bishop f6, and we get rook to d2, knight to c5, and now Magnus finally plays c4, opening up the diagonal. And to make matters worse for Wesley here, he's created a bit of Swiss cheese here. He's put all these pawns on light squares, and so after the bishops come off the board, there now are some serious dark square weaknesses around the king. Now, again, it's not that bad yet for Wesley, but Magnus has ideas like knight to e5, knight g4, knight f6, or knight h6 even, ideas like h4, h5, h6, going for the lolly mate on g7, and so it starts to feel a little bit uncomfortable. That being said, I think if this were a classical game, Wesley would be completely fine here and have no issues, but in a blitz game where you're trying not to use too much time, you want to have basic ideas. Magnus' ideas here with the dark square weaknesses are very, very straightforward and very clear cut. So Wesley plays rook a d8, Magnus trades the rooks, and now he plays this move h4, trying to play h5 and h6 and get the checkmate. Here Wesley plays queen to e7, Magnus plays h5, and now Wesley decides to take the pawn. Now, this move also very committal move here, but it's very hard to figure out a clear idea for black. If you don't take the pawn, I'm going to get h6. Say you play h5, a5, h6, f6, for example. After knight to d4 with ideas like knight c6, maybe b4, opening up the a file here, it just feels very, very unpleasant to play. Now, in a classical game, you could sit back, get some tea or coffee, think for 10, 15, 20 minutes, and probably be able to defend this position with no issues. But in a blitz game where you're going to have to play moves in 3, 4, 5 seconds with no clear-cut plans, Magnus having all the options here of going for b4, knight c6, etc., it's just too difficult to play from a practical standpoint. So Wesley decides to gobble on h5, and now Magnus plays queen e5, and here Wesley makes a blunder with knight takes b3. What Wesley should have played here was this move a5, simply because it gets rid of the weakness on a6. So now if I just play a random move, you can capture the pawn since the pawn is no longer hanging. Additionally, a5 also stops white from playing b4 and removing this pony on c5, so this would be a very, very standard logical move here. Now, if a5 had been played, probably Magnus would have gone knight d4, guarding the pawn, threatening the fork with knight c6, but now after black plays a move like rook to d7, for example, maybe not rook d7, because rook d7 actually allows probably some b4 tricks, maybe just a move like h6 even, and king h7 or queen g5, it's okay, because now if knight c6, you have queen d6 here, no checks on the g file, no check on g5 or g3, and black should be okay. So you find this, it's fine. Of course, knight f5 doesn't work because of queen g5 once again, and you cover all the critical squares as well. So a5 would be the best move, but again, very difficult to find. Players getting low on time, and Wesley decides to take the pawn on b3, and now Magnus captures on a6, and here Wesley plays queen to c5. Now already here, I think this is too difficult to defend in a blitz game. I think in a classical game even, this would be a big ask to defend here, but maybe it's possible. But with little time on the clock here, you don't know what to do. Your pawn on b6 is hanging, your pawn on h5 is hanging. There are ideas like queen g3 or queen g5. It's just too difficult, and Wesley finally makes a critical blunder by playing queen c5. Magnus plays queen to g3 check. We get king to f8, and now let's move knight to g5, threatening the pawn on h7. f7 and e6 are also very weak here, and white also has rook a7, creating the kebab on the 7th rank as well. Now, computer actually thinks that knight e5 is stronger and wins on the spot. I suspect the reason Magnus did not play knight to e5 is simply because if you go knight e5, the knight's a little bit loose here. Black can maybe play a move like h4. If you take the pawn, I can check the king and then capture the knight on e5. And it just feels like the knight and queen are a little bit loose. Maybe there's some distractions. Maybe there's some idea like rook d1 and knight d2, knight f1 as well. And granted, it doesn't work out, but intuitively it feels a little bit slippery. Whereas when you put the knight on g5, now you have knight takes h7 at all times, checking the king, so knight will always be a safe piece, and there's really no way for black to exploit that. So Wesley plays h6 here. Now computer says queen f5, and after rook to a7, apparently you can go queen g4 and you're not getting checkmated, but this is not really very human. It's not human at all, I should say, and so Wesley doesn't find it. Instead, Wesley plays h6, and now Magnus goes knight to h7 check. King to e7 is played, rook to d7, and now Magnus plays queen h4. Now in this position, queen to h4 would have won the game on the spot, and the reason that is that if Wesley plays king to d7 here, you have rook to a7 check. If king to c8, then you have rook to a8 check, winning the rook on d8, and after king to e8 is played here, you can simply go queen to f6, rook to d1, king h2, queen d6 check, and f4, and the mates on e7 and h8 are inevitable, as Thanos would say, and there's no way for black to avoid it. Nonetheless, we get the move rook to a7 instead. Rook to d7 played here by Wesley, queen to h4 check, king to d6, queen to f4, king e7, queen f6, king d6, and now Magnus decides to trade the rooks on d7. Now this move in and of itself is not, say, a blunder per se, but now it becomes difficult to win because there's limited material on the board, and black's king is going to be pretty safe, and black is going to end up with straightforward plans where he tries to win this pawn on c4. So we get king takes rook, queen takes pawn, queen to e7, knight to f6 check, king to d8, queen to g6, and now we have knight to a5. Now again, as I said, white is winning pawns on the king's side, but Wesley has a very clear-cut plan. Capture the juicer on c4 and just run the b pawn down the board, and with only queens and knights on the board, it doesn't really matter that the king on d8 is very weak here. So Magnus decides to take on h6. We get knight takes c4, knight takes h5. We have pawn to b5 being played here by Wesley, again trying to push the b pawn down the board. Knight to f4 is played by Magnus, king to d7, guarding the pawn on e6 here, and now queen to h5 is played, and Wesley plays king to c6, queen to f3, king to b6. And again, Wesley's king relatively safe here, just wants to push the b pawn down the board, but for Magnus, pushing the g4 pawn or winning the e4 pawn are the two priorities. So the game continues with queen to e4. We get king to a5 being played by Wesley here. We have knight takes e6. We get queen to b4 being played here, which is a mistake, obviously. At this point, probably queen to d7 is the best chance to keep it going. Already here, king a5 is probably a little bit questionable. Maybe you should just go queen to f6 here, offering the queen trade. And apparently after b4, knight d4, knight d2, this is not so easy to win for white. But Wesley probably thought, well, knight stopping the pawn, he just runs a g or f pawn. I just lose the game. What am I even doing? So he goes king to a5, and then we get to this position with knight e6, queen b4, queen to c2 played here by Magnus. A slight mistake here. Queen to a8 would have been stronger because after king to b6, you can play queen to b8, and now if black plays king to c6, at the very least, you have knight to d4 check, king to d5, and you just trade the queens on b5. And with 3 pawns extra here, white is completely winning. Black has no chance of counterplay. Magnus rather peculiarly plays queen to c2. Now again, both players probably down to seconds on the clock here, so you can't be too critical, but now the show goes on. The game continues with queen to e1, king to h2, and now Wesley plays knight to d2. Once again, this queen to d2 move would have been very strong, because after the queen trade, you just automatically assume g4, b4, and knight to d4 is winning for white. But after king to b6 here, if you go g5, now white can play b3, and after g6, there's b2. If you play knight takes b3 here, after knight f3, king g3, knight g5, computer only says +2. I don't know why, because this probably is winning, but the show goes on. So instead we get knight to d2, King to g3 played here by Magnus, simply guarding the pawn. Wesley plays knight to f1, king to f4 played here, knight back to d2, and now king g3, knight f1, king to g4 is played. Magnus just trying to gain a little bit of extra time on the clock here before he plays a different move. Knight back to d2, and now we get queen to c3 check here. King on g4, maybe a little bit safer than f4 because queen takes f2 will never be a check. Game finishes with b4, queen to c5, king to a4, and now we have knight d4 threatening queen to a7 checkmate because the knight holds both the critical squares. So queen f2, queen a7. Just to illustrate it, king has no squares to run to. So we get b3. Queen to b5 check is played, king to a3, and now in a very cute manner, Magnus sacks the queen, does a Botez gambit with queen takes b3, but it's not a true gambit because after knight takes queen and knight c2, Wesley resigns the game. The king and the queen are forked, and after you move the king, knight takes queen is played. White has 3 extra pawns. Very straightforward win for Magnus. So Magnus wins the second game, and this really starts to get him on a roll. And now we're going to look at one more game that Magnus played today in the Warsaw, Poland Blitz. So this is a game he played with a black piece against Richard Rapport, the famous second of Ding Liren in the World Championship match. So the game starts with d4, we get knight to f6, and now here Richard decides to play the classic Trump house key opening with bishop g5. Now those of you guys who thought you heard me say a weird word, you did. This opening is in fact called the Trompovsky in honor of a famous Brazilian master many years ago. Not quite what you guys thought you heard before. So after bishop g5, we get e6 here played by Magnus. Knight d2 is played here, now h6, bishop h4, c5, e3, takes, bishop e7. Very slow, very standard opening by Magnus here. Just developing the bishop and the knight here, maybe castling, maybe playing d5. Also keeping ideas alive with b6 as well. So Magnus just doesn't want to commit to this fixed pawn structure and keeps other options available. So we get c3, b6 played by Magnus, bishop to d3, bishop to a6 played here. Now this is an interesting move. Normally you'd expect bishop b7 attacking the pawn on g2, but after knight to f3, White has this great bishop, which you see in the London, the Tory, and many other systems on d3, and has a lot of scope on multiple diagonals. So Magnus decides, let's trade off the light square bishops, because if the light square bishops come off the board, now White will never have any threats on this long diagonal, and the king will just be very safe. Now again, very equal position, not very special, but nonetheless, it takes away some of the bite from a potential attack. So after bishop a6, we get queen to f3 being played here by Richard. We get pawn to d5 now by Magnus, because with the bishop on a6, there is really no good reason not to play d5. And additionally, you are under attack here. The rook on a8 is hanging. If you move the knight, you hang your bishop. If you push the pawn, you avoid that, and I guess if you take the bishop, maybe, I don't know if White's supposed to take the rook or the bishop, but either way, it appears White can take this rook, and now White has a bunch of extra material. So we get d5, bishop to c2 played by Richard here. Richard decides, you know what, I can now move my knight to e2 and castle my king to the king side, or still go long to the queen side. So Magnus plays knight c6, we get knight to e2, and now Magnus plays this move, knight to e4, trying to strike it in the center right away. Now this move is not necessarily the best move, but it's completely reasonable, because what's going to happen is we're going to have some mass exchanges of the bishops and the knights here. So Richard decides to take on e7. Now, if he were to play knight takes knight, for example, Magnus would capture the bishop on h4. After you move the knight back, he would move his bishop back to e7. And now black has the bishop pair here combined with a slightly favorable central pawn structure here. You can always play for like f6 and e5 down the road. And so I would rather be black here. And for that reason, Richard decides to take the bishop on e7 instead. So we get knight takes knight on d2, and now Richard goes insane. He plays queen takes pawn on f7. Now in this position, what Richard should have done is he should have just taken the knight on d2 with the king, and after queen takes bishop, played rook a to e1 with the idea of going king to c1. And the computer says that after castles and king c1, position is relatively balanced here. Both sides have castled their kings to the queen sides. Not a whole lot happening in the center. Very hard for black to attack on the queen side, because if you play b5 and b4, suddenly after moves like rook c1, the c file is opening up here down the road, and black's king is going to be under a lot of pressure. So it's not easy for black to attack on the queen side. Both queen sides are pretty stable here, so I would say maybe white has a small advantage, but it's relatively balanced. Instead, Richard decides to go queen takes f7, sacking the queen. King takes queen is played, bishop takes queen on d8 here, and now Magnus plays knight c4, which is an excellent move. Most likely Richard missed this idea, and he just simply thought that he was up a pawn. But after knight to c4, the problem for Richard here is the pawn on b2 is under attack, but your bishop on d8 is also under attack. So if you try to save the pawn with b3 attacking the knight, now there's knight a3, and you're going to lose one of these two bishops here. There's no way to guard both of them. and so you have to move the bishop instead. And after bishop c7, knight takes b2. Even though the computer thinks white is still relatively okay, you have this very weak compromised pawn structure on the queen side. Black is getting pressure on the c file instantly, and it just feels really, really bad. So here Richard plays h4, Magnus goes rook c8, we get rook to b1, knight to c4, and now we have this move bishop to f4, which effectively loses the game on the spot. Now, to be clear, this position already is really, really bad for white, but probably after bishop to e5, knight takes e5, takes, and rook h3, while they're down a pawn, maybe there's some glimmer of hope. Computer actually thinks this is quite reasonable, and if black were to play knight to a3, which is another option here as well, after rook c1, takes, knight b4, you can now play rook back to c1, knight d3, king d2, takes, and here you do have a great wooden shield with a bishop on e5. Now, mind you, this is still much worse probably for white, but there are some chances due to this great bishop on e5. Nonetheless, Richard goes bishop f4, we get knight to a3, rook to b2, knight takes bishop, rook takes, knight to b4, and now suddenly out of nowhere, Richard just decides to throw in the towel and resign the game. Now, it's fairly shocking because he could still play rook c1 and play a similar variation as to the game, but this is the Magnus effect. Richard just assumed that after takes, rook c4, bishop e5, rook c8, king d3, and rook a4, rook c2. Why bother? There's b5, rook a3, b4, and it's just going to be a GG, why not, as opposed to trying to struggle on. Now, I understand that decision by Richard, but nonetheless, I still think that it was worth a chance in a blitz game to try and play on, to try and keep it going. But Richard obviously not having a great tournament, so he just decides to throw in the towel. Magnus does win that game, so that's his second win of the day. Now, Magnus would continue to steamroll the opposition again on day 2 of the blitz. He would score 7 points out of 9 in the blitz on the second day, and he would win the tournament with a combined score overall of 24 points. He finished, I believe, 1 point ahead of Jan-Krzysztof Duda, who had 23 points. Duda had a great rapid event. He had a decent blitz event, but not a great blitz event. And Magnus is able to steamroll everybody in the blitz portion, win the rapid and blitz event being held in Warsaw, Poland, once again establishing how strong he truly is when he is not quote-unquote rusty like he was on the first day. So very, very impressive performance by Magnus in the Superbet Rapid and Blitz being held in Warsaw, Poland. Magnus will obviously be coming back to Norway soon to compete in Norway chess, which is where I am at the moment. Obviously, that's why I'm locked in this jail cell, because until the tournament begins, I can't record from anywhere else. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap. Make sure to hit that subscribe button below if you haven't already, and I'll be back soon with some more great YouTube-only content. See you guys. Bye.